So, welcome to today's presentation. Uh, this presentation will cover affirmatively furthering fair housing. My name is Derek. I'll be your presenter today. I am the educator at the Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan. I am a white guy with red hair, and I am wearing a black shirt today. Before we get into it, we'd like to make some quick acknowledgments. First and foremost, we are not attorneys at the Fair Housing Center. And so today's information is for educational purposes only. It is not legal advice, it can't be construed as such. As I've mentioned, this session is being recorded. And finally, a shout out to the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, without whom we would not be able to offer this and other trainings free of charge. So, a little bit about the Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan. We serve Allegan, Berry, Berrien Branch, Calhoun, Cass, Kalamazoo, St. Joseph, and Van Buren counties here in Southwest Michigan. And we promote integration and work to eliminate housing discrimination through education, advocacy, and enforcement of the fair housing law. That ordering is intentional. The Office of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, estimates that annually there are 4 million occurrences of housing discrimination. Of those, only about 11,000 are reported. So by beginning with education, we figure if we can educate well enough, ideally we eliminate housing discrimination before it begins. So that would be supply side education of landlords and other housing providers. Uh, Through educating tenants and other folks, we can also encourage people to recognize and report discrimination that may be happening to them. And after that, we can advocate on their behalf and we can work to secure justice through enforcement of the fair housing. And finally, as we learn through our efforts and successes in enforcement, we get a better idea of how to best shape and direct our educational programs to maximize the effect of our work. So, the effect of our work, what is fair housing? Fair housing, in a nutshell, is the right to equitable access to housing and all services involved in the housing transaction. This includes renting, advertising, financing a house, buying a house, insuring a house, having a home you already own appraised for later sale. Anything that has to do with the housing transaction is covered under the Fair Housing Act. And so the goal of this session today is to give you more information that can help protect you and the members of your communities. And a lot of the training is designed around the tenant's perspective today, but it's also important that housing providers understand their the fair housing laws and their responsibilities as described therein. We don't expect anyone to memorize everything today or to leave here as a fair housing expert. Uh, you can always feel free to call us at the Fair Housing Center if you have any questions. So, another way to say that fair housing is the right to equitable access to housing is to say that you have the right to be free from discrimination. And housing discrimination follows a formula of which there are three elements to determine whether something actually is housing discrimination. The first element of that formula is whether or not it's happening in a covered dwelling. And so, what we mean by a covered dwelling, I'll get into in a little bit more detail here in just a moment. But very nearly all residential constructions are covered by fair housing. A protected person is the second element of the formula. And federally, there are 7 protected classes of person: the person's race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation and gender identity, family status, and disability status. Cannot be used to discriminate against a person. This is what we mean by a protected person. State and local governments can add to but never remove those protections. And each of those protections were won over time. And we'll cover that timeline here in a little bit. And finally, an unlawful practice needs to have occurred. And that is to say that it's any practice that treats differently one member of a protected class from someone who does not fall within that protected class, or rather, uh, treating differently any member of a protected class during any part of a housing transaction, whether through intention or effect. And again, we'll go into that a little bit more here in just a moment. So the first element is covered dwelling or covered housing. So let's look at what constitutes that. A dwelling under fair housing law is to be construed as broadly as possible. You'll see that this list is not exhaustive. Um, there are very limited exceptions uh, to what constitutes a covered dwelling under the Fair Housing Act. Um, and accepting those exceptions, all places of residence that are not strictly commercial ventures, something like a hotel or a motel, will be covered by the Fair Housing. Further, as I've mentioned, all aspects of the housing transaction are covered. So not only will the Fair Housing Act prohibit kicking a person out of their rented apartment based on, let's say, their nation of origin, but it would protect that same person from that same nation of origin discrimination in the rental application process, in the process of securing a loan for home ownership, the appraisal of a home. You'll notice also here in the list that we have housing construction sites, homeowners associations, public housing authorities. These aren't dwellings as such. Nobody's living inside the homeowners association. But because they affect the housing transaction, they are also covered by the Fair Housing Act. Finally, we've had this question come up a few times in trainings, but there are such things as mixed use dwellings, like an Airbnb or a long term hotel stay, and they present an edge case in how fair housing law applies. And the guideline there is largely based on someone's primary residence, or rather the presence of a primary residence. So, in the case of hotels, for instance, fair housing laws seldom apply because a guest in a hotel usually has a primary residence somewhere else. In shelter for the unhoused, however, despite the stay sometimes being a short or shorter than a hotel stay, fair housing does apply in these cases because no other primary residence exists. So these are the types of housing that are covered. What types of housing are exempted? There are three classes of dwelling where the fair housing laws are exempted. See here the religious organization exemption, the Mrs. Murphy rule or smallholder exemption, and then the Senior Designated Housing or Housing for Older Persons Act exemption. So to start at the top, in limited circumstances, the Fair Housing Act will make exemption for housing operated by religious organizations. That is to say, they are exempted from the religious protected characteristic, protected class under fair housing law. Religious organizations are allowed to give preference to people of the same religion um, if that housing follows a couple of rules. Um, the housing needs to be non-commercial. It can't be rented. It needs to be provided freely. Welcome. Uh, Welcome. So, yes, religious organizations are allowed to give preference to people of the same religion if the housing is non commercial and the religion itself doesn't discriminate based on other protected classes. So, for example, a Catholic organization can legally limit occupancy or at least give preference to Catholic occupants if it leases apartments at a property and is not then renting those apartments. Uh, the Mrs. Murphy rule, as it's known, is a smallholder exemption. That is, it exempts housing owners who live in the building that they rent from the fair housing laws. So, federally, a residence comprising 4 or fewer units that is presently occupied by the owner or a member of the owner's immediate family is exempt from fair housing law under this rule. Each state has its own particular version of the Mrs. Murphy rule, and Michigan's mirrors the federal while restricting that residence count to 2 or fewer units. Uh, and in the housing meant for older persons, it is exempt federally from only familial status protections and is separated into two categories: housing for persons 55 and older, and housing for persons 62 and older. A number of rules apply to those types of housing, and that is that in housing meant for persons 55 or older, 80% of units need to be occupied by at least one person, at least 55 years old or older, and the terms, regulations, and advertisements of the dwelling must clearly state the intent to operate as such. Housing for persons 62 years old or older must be 100% occupied by at least one resident of that age. Often, disabled people can live in in either class of dwelling, regardless of their age. And in both cases, uh, further exemptions exist that allow caretakers and employees of the dwelling to live there, regardless of their age or family status. So, what are the protected classes? You'll see them outlined here, federally in blue, and here in Michigan in green. Federally, there are 7 protected classes. No state can limit those protections, but can add to them. Here in Michigan, the additional protected classes that apply most to housing are age and marital status. The controlling Michigan civil rights laws do list more than just age and marital status as additional protected classes, but those extra protections apply usually only to cases of employment instead of housing. So, although, for instance, height is a protected class under Michigan disability law, people usually aren't being kicked out of their apartment for being too tall. The most recently protected class in Michigan is source of income, and that was signed into law late 2024. We'll be going into that a fair bit here today. Throughout the training, I'll be using both class and characteristic to refer to the protected classes. Excuse me. The protected classes is the language within the fair housing law, but sometimes that's a little clunky. So I use characteristic more or less interchangeably. So race refers to one's race and includes all races. Color refers to the color of one's skin. So a darker skinned person of Indian origin has the same rights as one with lighter skin. Religion includes one's membership or lack thereof in an organized religious group, as well as one's spiritual ideas or beliefs. National origin refers to the country where a person was born or where their ancestors came. Sexual orientation and gender identity. You'll notice under the federally protected classes, only sex is listed. However, under Michigan, sexual orientation and gender identity are both listed. We'll get into that here in just a moment. But sexual orientation and gender identity pertains to one's actual or perceived sexual orientation, as well as the identity, expression, or perception thereof. This includes one's relevant attitudes, preferences, beliefs, practices of their gender, irrespective of its relation to their sex assigned at birth. Uh, familial status refers to the presence of one or more children under 18 in the household, as long as they have a custodial relationship with them. So that's a parent, a step parent, adoptive parents, legal guardians, foster parents, people who are in the process of acquiring legal custody of a child. Disability, this protected class is the most commonly cited, pardon me, most commonly cited protected class in fair housing complaints. Uh, and it refers to people who are actively living with a disability, have a history of living with a disability, or are perceived as having had a disability. Marital status refers to whether a person is single, married, separated, engaged, divorced, uh, and in some jurisdictions simply cohabitating. Age, of course, refers to individuals of any age. Source of income, finally, means that a person seeking housing cannot be turned away if part of their income comes from Social Security, housing choice vouchers. Uh, Income is income. Now, what laws got us here? So, as I mentioned, the protections afforded by fair housing were won over time. We have a brief timeline here. It's by no means comprehensive, but it's a snapshot of those moments where new protections were added. So first we have the Civil Rights Act of 1862. This is shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War, and importantly, the ratifications of Amendments 13 and 14. Um, Amendment 14 having made these newly freed slaves, as well as all native born Americans, citizens. Uh, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 primarily deals with their new property rights. Um, a little more than 100 years later, uh, through a lot of political activism in the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century, despite all that, race based housing patterns persisted. So, for instance, while Black and Hispanic members of the US military were fighting and dying. Overseas, the families at home often struggled to rent or to purchase housing in residential areas because of their race, color, religion, or national origin. And so, following pressure from organizations such as the NAACP and the GI Forum, which was primarily a group primarily comprised of Hispanic soldiers, as well as the intense pressure generated by the assassination of Martin Luther King and the subsequent riots in more than 100 US cities, uh, LBJ President Lyndon Baines Johnson was pushed to finally sign the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 is what is now known as the Fair Housing Act, and this act establishes race, color, national origin, and religion as protected classes in housing transactions. The Fair Housing Act would be further amended in 1974 first to add sex as a protected class, and then again in 1988 to add family and disability status as protected classes. In 2021, under the Biden administration, Executive Order 13988 expanded on the protections of the 1974 amendment, expanded on the protected characteristic of sex to include all sexual orientations and gender identities. Um, excuse me. And alongside the federal fair housing laws, state and local governments passed their own fair housing laws. Here in Michigan, that fair housing law is the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. It mirrors the federal protections and adds marital status and age protections in 1975. Later, in 2023, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act was amended to mirror the language of Executive Order 13988, which is to say that it added those protections to all sexual orientations and gender identity. Finally, a bill package that included Senate Bill 205 here in Michigan added source of income. This was signed right at the end of 2024. And we'll go into a couple of recent changes here. As you'll recall, I've been there's been an asterisk on sex and sexual orientation, gender identity. On January 20th, 2025, an executive order was issued that repealed the sexual orientation and gender identity protections and relimited that characteristic to just one sex. And as of April 23rd, 2025, what's known as a disparate impact analysis no longer obtains in federal civil rights cases. We'll get to that in just a second here. So, by adding source of income protections, a landlord cannot discriminate if a tenant's income includes Section 8 housing choice vouchers, public assistance, veterans benefits, Social Security, supplemental security income, disability payments, other retirement programs. Any legally derived source of income that is not a paycheck falls under source of income. And we'll be going again into depth on these SOI protections here in a moment. So there are 4 forms of discrimination, or 4 theories on how to look at discrimination. That is discriminatory intent or active mistreatment of a person, disparate impact, which is a passive or neutral action that nevertheless mistreats a protected class. Retaliation is negative action after a person asserts their rights. The failure to accommodate is neglecting to allow reasonable accommodations or modifications that better allow a person with a disability to fully enjoy and use their fully use and enjoy their dwelling. So again, only behavior that involves one or more of the protected classes is illegal under the Fair Housing Act. So for example, a landlord who refuses to rent an apartment to a prospective tenant has not, in that refusal, alone violated the act. So a covered practice, refusal to rent, and a covered property, this apartment, are involved unless it can be shown that the landlord's action was based on a protected class or had a disparate impact on a protected class. Unless that can be shown, it can't be said that discrimination has occurred. So for instance, if the landlord refused to rent to a person because of the prospect's bad credit, no violation of the act has occurred. The landlord doesn't need to have been acting maliciously or otherwise with discriminatory intent. The practice is prohibited even if it has a disparate impact. which is again to say that a practice can appear neutral, but because of how protected classes intersect with reality, has a disparate impact. So I like the following hypothetical as an illustration for that. Let's say that a property developer wants to build affordable housing specifically intended for occupation by an area's nurses. Career is not a protected class, so that should be fine. People may even line up behind it because of the apparent nobility of the nursing profession, right? However, in this developer's area, 95% of nurses are white. So if you attempt to limit access to the dwelling only to the area's nurses, the developer then unintentionally limits access based on race, creating a disparate impact. Retaliation is always out of bounds, even when a complaint itself does not constitute an example of illegal housing discrimination. If the housing provider is then to retaliate by, say, raising the rent or withholding maintenance, uh, that is now a violation of the fair. And finally, again, failure to accommodate is a housing provider's failure to allow reasonable accommodations, which are changes to rules, policies, and procedures, or reasonable modifications that are changes to the physical space or information available in that space that better allow a person living with a disability to exercise their right to full use and enjoyment. And as I've mentioned, disparate impact is an angle of analysis for assessing discrimination has recently been said to be invalid in federal jurisdictions. So that's sort of the broad overview of fair housing, the nuts and bolts, the 101. We'll go now into today's topic, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing. And affirmatively furthering fair housing is a provision written into the 1968 Fair Housing the authors of that act knew that simply halting housing discrimination was only one aspect of bringing equity to people's lives. The act, therefore, also has as its purpose eliminating racial segregation in communities. That is to say, undoing the historical damages of housing discrimination up to that point. But another way, the act charges programs to work to affirmatively further fair housing. So, the Fair Housing Act not only prohibits discrimination, but in conjunction with other statutes, directs HUD's programs participants to take significant actions to overcome historic patterns of segregation. This will help. The aim is to help achieve truly balanced and integrated living patterns, to promote fair housing choice, and to foster inclusive communities that are free from discrimination. Now, the rules of affirmatively furthering fair housing, I'll be calling it AFFH. The AFFH rules typically apply legally only to those programs sponsored by HUD or otherwise receiving federal monies for housing, but they should serve as a guide for all housing justice oriented work. And to that end, HUD, when following AFFH rules, usually carries out that engagement with AFFH by extending those obligations to the recipients of HUD funding. So HUD funds MISHDA in part, and therefore MISHDA has an obligation at certain times to affirmatively further fair housing. Now, originally, the Fair Housing Act approached AFFH by requiring, among other things, what is known as an analysis of impediments. The analysis is meant to ensure that HUD money is distributed to programs that have, at the very least, analyzed local effects of historical patterns of racial segregation. The analysis of impediments is no longer a tool that is used by HUD or HUD programs. Um, in 2015, under the final Obama administration, the analysis of impediments was replaced with what is called an assessment of fair housing. So, although each jurisdiction would handle the details of their assessment of fair housing differently and according to jurisdictional needs, the basic structure uh, remains the same and consists of four parts. So, first, during data delivery, HUD would provide jurisdictions, so city councils, public housing agencies, other entities requesting HUD funding with data on HUD-wide core goals. The jurisdiction would then use that data package to analyze the community and its fair housing issues and needs and submit through a HUD approved template um, its report on those needs. That report would inform the, excuse me, that template and report contains information about the investment planning process. That is how that HUD money will be used. And usually that includes engagement with key members of the public and other local stakeholders. So these jurisdictions, after a period of analysis and input, submit those plans to HUD. HUD then approves the funding request or else provides the feedback that would allow them to approve that funding request. Are there shortfalls? Are there other overlooked issues? And finally, during incorporation into planning and subsequent action, HUD would incorporate the broader data trends that it collects from jurisdictions into its priorities planning for the future. This was the rule in 2015. Uh, Following the Obama administration in 2020, it was rescinded. It was then reinstated in 2021, and it has since again been rescinded. So, affirmatively furthering fair housing as a legal requirement is sort of unstable. It's directly mandated by HUD. And so, because of that instability, um, as well as the varied jurisdiction specific implementation of rule adherent projects, an assessment of fair housing is going to look different here in Kalamazoo than it does in Detroit. We're going to look today instead at high level, broadly applicable programs that act to affirmatively further fair housing goals without necessarily being described by the rules laid out by any particular administration. So, in order to understand how the programs we're going to discuss can be used to affirmatively further fair housing, first we need to examine how historical discrimination has brought about a deep link between race and economic status as it relates to housing. And one of the best lenses for this is redlining. So, this is going to be a very brief overview of redlining. But redlining as a legal process was prohibited by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Before this, however, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, begun under the New Deal under President FDR, immortalized the practice in maps. These maps famously assigned grades A through D, where D is deemed the riskiest area to make homeowners loans. Uh, the practice gets its name because those grades were also colored. Uh, Grade A was colored green, B blue, C yellow, and D red, based on the supposed probability of homeowners or prospective buyers defaulting on mortgage loans. So these maps were drawn by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but they were informed by the underwriting guides previously published by the by the Federal Housing Administration. When these guides were not directly maligning Black communities and their fitness for paying loans, that is to say, the FHA underwriting guides, they would couch their racism in phrases like, quote, infiltration by disharmonious racial groups, end quote. And when they were couching the language like that, they were typically referring to um, immigrant white communities and the possibility of the spread into non-immigrant white zones. And if you have not yet seen a redlining map, we have here the redlining maps for Kalamazoo on the left and the redlining map for Battle Creek on the right. And while the exact geographic details and modern correspondences of these maps is a little bit beyond today's scope, it's difficult to overstate just how lasting of an impact these maps have had. The reason, one of the reasons at least, for this lasting impact is that in the United States, home ownership is the number one means of generating wealth. By assessing Black and Brown, and to a lesser extent immigrant white communities, as the most unlikely to repay their home loans, banks were less likely to originate loans in these areas, that is to say, disperse the money to those areas. Without those loans, people could not move out of those areas. This necessarily homogenizes along racial lines those same areas. By not originating loans in those communities, there was less money for repairs and construction, which necessarily dilapidates the area. And so, through that racial homogenizing process and a progressive degradation by stagnant money flow, these communities grow even less attractive to outside non bank investment. Jobs don't move in. Um, all of this, to say nothing of the overarching racial animosities of white America in this time, all of this is the beginning of a powerful systematic loop of racial housing segregation. Now, of course, that's not to say that every member of every community was from that moment forever doomed. People were able to remove themselves from the loop, but they had a sturdy disadvantage. In 1940, according to Fox Business, the median home value was $2,938. When you adjust that for inflation, that's equivalent to $64,372 in 2024. Uh, Comparing that to the average home price now, according to Redfin, which is a real estate business aggregator, uh, the median home price now in 2025 is $437,800. Excuse me, $437,860. This is a difference in modern dollars of $373,492. And put another way, that means that home value has increased by roughly $4,400 every year during the 85 years since 19. And this is a toy model of home valuation. Other things have happened than just a steady linear growth of value. But I do find it illustrative. And because of their status as investment vehicles and the relative scarcity of real property, that is to say, land on which to build homes, no factory process can be made more efficient that is going to let us print cheaper acreage. Housing price and the wealth of the owners of that housing increases rapidly. So being locked out of home ownership through processes such as redlining for any amount of time has real dollar consequences. Even now, at a time when redlining has been outlawed for nearly 60 years, although unfortunately still practiced, there was recently a case tried by the U.S. Department of Civil Rights, U.S. v. the Mortgage Firm 2025, that alleges redlining in Florida. Um, Even now, that gap is clear. So if we look at this graph, which I've taken from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we can see that gap. If you look at the wealth of homeowners, it is disparate along racial and ethnic lines. Uh, it is disparate along racial and ethnic lines. The What do we have here? $250,000 difference between the median net wealth of white homeowners and black homeowners. That's the legacy of redlining. If you compare the wealth of homeowners to that of renters, you can see that the gap is even more staggering. It should go without saying then that the trend continues downward to when individuals are chronically unhoused. They have even less wealth. So before I go farther, I do want to make a brief note that it is, of course, not the case that all communities of colors are stranded in poverty or unable to purchase homes. There's nothing endemic about race or ethnicity or any difference along the other protected classes that determines a person's ability to gather purchasing power. The history of housing in the United States, however, has linked these characteristics. It can be safely said that housing programs that uplift the financially precarious also tend to uplift individuals marginalized along their race, their color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation or gender identity, family, or disability status. So, although affirmatively furthering fair housing by the letter of the law applies only to those programs sponsored by HUD or other federal programs, I argue here that any practice that seeks to foster homeownership among non-white buyers, uh, any practice that seeks to remove rental precarity, such that a home can be saved for, perhaps, or any practice that lifts people into stable rentals from chronic homelessness, such that they might begin the process. Uh, any of these programs can be said to affirmatively further fair housing. And we'll look now at some of those programs and projects. I've chosen here as 4 affirmatively fair projects: source of income protections, inclusionary zoning, landlord mitigation reserves, and the COVID-19 related emergency rental assistance program. These programs, implemented fully, can help to begin to reverse historical discrimination in their areas of practice, as well as to limit contemporary housing discrimination. First, source of income protections open the housing market to individuals who receive financial assistance. This allows new entry into previously economically segregated communities, which, as we've discussed, economically economic segregation tends to go hand in hand with other types of segregation. Inclusionary zoning ties the creation of affordable below market rate units with new development. It's intended as a means for creating affordable housing programs and inclusive communities. Landlord mitigation reserves are programs that incentivize landlords to accept quote unquote risky tenants. These are usually felons or individuals with substance use disorders. Uh, Chronically homeless veterans are also often targeted by these programs. Um, but they incentivize landlords to accept those risky tenants by offering to compensate a landlord for um, any emergent damages, late fees, or other arrearages that can be incurred by these candidates, the instability in these candidates' lives. And then finally, we'll look at the COVID-19 related emergency rental assistance program as an effort that was designed to reduce precarity throughout the pandemic, but whose implementation um, was a bit troubled, and we'll discuss that as we get to it. And each of these programs has had its challenges, and we'll briefly discuss them in turn. So we begin with source of income protections. Michigan in 2024 became the 18th state to offer SOI protections. Before that, 85 cities, probably more now, as that's a figure from 2022 from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, have implemented source of income protections. So the protections of the Fair Housing Act only extend to those individuals who are able to make a bona fide offer on their housing. You're not by law guaranteed a home free from discrimination if you can't afford if you can't afford a home in the first place. That said, in many jurisdictions, not all income is treated as income in the calculus of what determines a bona fide offer. So source of income protections are designed to correct that. For instance, in areas without source of income protections, a landlord is within their rights to look at a social security disbursement, say, and view that person as a riskier tenant. The income is not counted as income in the same way that paychecks are. But more often than Social Security or other supplemental income payments, there has been a tendency to view housing choice vouchers, formerly Section 8, as a negative indicator of tenant reliability. So if you consider that in conjunction with the growing number of jurisdictions that offer housing choice vouchers, not only when renting, but when attempting to purchase a home, it becomes clear how SOI protections can be used to affirmatively further fair housing. So any process by which individuals are helped to leave, say, a redlined area in which they previously found themselves, affirmatively furthers fair housing. While home ownership is key to building personal wealth, stably housed individuals are in a far better position to contribute to local economies. And when we say that SOI protections can have the effect of reducing concentrations of poverty, it's not simply about dispersing or spreading that poverty around the map. If you lift a person out of an area of highly concentrated poverty, in this case by having their whole income counted as income and not having parts of it looked down upon, if you can lift that person up and they find themselves in an area generally um, in an area with less concentrated poverty, they'll generally find more opportunity, better jobs, better services. So reducing concentrations of poverty doesn't merely disperse, but in point of fact, eliminates poverty over time. However, again, it's not without its challenges. As beneficial as SOI protections can be, there's always room for improvement. First and foremost, their implementation is not standardized. They've not been adopted federally, and so each municipality has different rules affecting um, who is beholden to these protections. So here in Michigan, The number of properties a housing provider must own before being beholden to these rules is five. Compare that to the Mrs. Murphy small holding exemption of two or fewer properties for federally. Our colleague Steve Tomkowiak of the Metro Detroit Fair Housing Center in Detroit published an article in 2023 counting the number of units that would be affected by this. So, of 141,616 rental units in Detroit, only 46,584 were held by owners of five or more properties. That means that in Detroit, only 33% of rental units are protected by the rule. So, this case, while the numbers are different across the state, is likely to persist as we travel throughout Michigan. Landlords are not obligated by this or any other rule to accept housing choice vouchers. It is only that if they do, they cannot discriminate against their HC housing choice voucher holding tenants when compared to those who do not hold that voucher. And so this opt-in process is further frustrated by the real or imagined administrative cost of managing the program. Uh, housing t- Housing choice vouchers, and it bears acknowledging here that they are not the only type of supplemental income, but are the ones most often at issue with SOI protections. They are administered through local public housing agencies or otherwise entities acting as such. And these organizations will pay the landlord. The money is not given first to the tenant, who would then pay the landlord. The organization and the landlord sign an agreement, and maintaining that clerical information to ensure the stability and transparency of the agreement can be more than some landlords are willing to take on. Time is moving faster than I thought, so we'll move hastily along. Another practice is inclusionary zoning. So, with some important caveats, exclusionary zoning, which is the dominant form of zoning in the United States, can be thought of, I think, as a sort of soft redlining by limiting the types of development that can be carried out in particular areas. That tends to deepen the already present character of that area. So, under typical zoning practices, new housing development seldom penetrates traditionally low income areas. A notable exception is the process of gentrification, but again, that's beyond today's scope. And similarly, development that is accessible to low income residents is typically not built in affluent areas. And so inclusionary zoning is a willful practice of reversing that effect. It's not designed usually to bring high price development into economically depressed areas, but is designed to provide for at least some affordability or some access to the new developments that otherwise would make no such allowance. And again, recall that reducing concentration of poverty does not disperse, but rather eliminate poverty. By guaranteeing that at least some portion of new housing will be accessible to the less moneyed, we can ensure that people will have access to better jobs, better services, better opportunities, where previously those jobs, services, and opportunities could be constrained. And even if we don't want to call them better, different. And so that increases housing choice. Um, you can also think of it, if you don't want to think of exclusionary zoning as a sort of soft redlining, you can think of inclusionary zoning as a policy level source of income protection uh, baked into how a city plans its development. And again, because of how poverty and historical housing discrimination are intertwined, inclusionary zoning can ease racial segregation in areas that adopt the practice. So, what are some problems or challenges to inclusionary zoning? It's a policy adoption, and so it faces political opposition. Um, you know, policymakers, uh, stakeholders, lobbyists, for whatever myriad political motivations they have, there usually tends to be at least some opposition toward opening certain areas of cities and towns to the previously excluded. Um, as much fun as it would be to sit and try to sort through all those political motivations for maintaining status quo, we're going to have to here focus on the last listed challenge. That is income targeting. Often, inclusionary zoning programs do not serve very low income residents. It's possible to do this, but it's a harder sell. Uh, it And in so doing, it fails to capture those most at risk in our community. Very low income are seldom considered in these policy proposals, despite being of the greatest need. And reversing or reducing that trend would be a great step forward in a mission to affirmatively further fair housing. We'll go now into landlord mitigation reserves. Landlord mitigation reserves, you know, a person's life has challenges that aren't just housing. It's my belief and the animus for my work in the fair housing field that these challenges become exceptionally more difficult without safe and secure, or what one might call fair housing. A person who struggles with addiction may not prioritize reckoning with that struggle if they aren't sure whether they'll have to sleep outside that. A person who is re-entering society after serving time in jail will struggle to secure a job without a permanent address. Landlord mitigation reserves, although not exceedingly common programs, aim to help those populations. Further, these populations often intersect with the classes protected under the Fair Housing Act. So these are municipal set asides of capital to cover late rent payments and damages. And there is a rather robust application and certification process. So, because they only cover damages, late fees, other arrearages, these programs do not in themselves guarantee or secure housing for these at-risk populations. They do, however, help, excuse me, they do, however, help to foster landlord confidence in the suitability of a tenant. So, if a person can go from living on the street to renting an apartment to perhaps one day buying their own home, these programs are affirmatively furthering fair housing. By reserving cash for arrearages or damages, landlord mitigation reserves absorb instability. If a person accepted into a program such as this has, for instance, their car breakdown and thereby they lose their job, um, if they're then kicked out of their apartment, they lose a permanent address. It makes it more difficult to get a new job. It makes it more difficult to get another car, find a new apartment, etc. The cycle repeats. If instead that person is given grace in missing some payments, they may show themselves down the line to be a model tenant. They don't get trapped back in that cycle again. And I consider that affirmatively furthering fair housing. Some challenges to landlord mitigation reserves. They are by definition, excuse me, they do by definition require funding. Where that funding comes from can be inconsistent. Because of the limited funds, the application process can be rigorous, and the programs do require a pretty great degree of trust and faith, trust whose development requires time and faith. They're a mutually constructed safety net, and as such, they are difficult to organize and a challenge to fund. Finally, we're getting into the COVID-19 Emergency Rental Assistance Program. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, it should go without saying, marked a tremendously uncertain period in the lives of ordinary Americans. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program aimed to ease that uncertainty by providing monies that could help to insulate individuals from loss of income through work furlough, through layoffs, through illness, the more grim circumstances pervading the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So roughly $46 billion were earmarked for that insulation. This is down from an originally proposed $100 billion and dispersed in two rollouts known as ERA1 and ERA2. States and localities were given flexibility in implementing spending. And as the money was handed down to states, the states then further distributed it to municipalities and organizations. The goal again was stability. A rented apartment that stays rented benefits not only the tenant, but the landlord and the municipality in which that rented apartment is located. Unemployment programs and eviction freezes were initiated at the same time. However, the evictions would eventually be unfrozen, and the calculus for unemployment payments depended on previous income. These aspects of those programs, while plainly better than doing nothing, still left uncertainty in being able to afford rent. People receiving unemployment payments were typically making less than their previous wage, while rents remained the same, and that exacerbated cost burdens. And even before the pandemic, nearly half of all renters were cost burdened, which is to say that more than 30% of their income went toward rent. And that's from the Joint Center on Housing Studies in 2008. Now, the funds as they were distributed did not always make it down to the people who needed them. And the reason there were two rollouts, or one of the reasons there were two rollouts, is Treasury was directing recipients to recapture and redistribute unused. It was not a very good plan, and the National Apartment Association president and CEO Bob Pinniger called the assistance rollout a disaster marred with programmatic inefficiencies and difficulties. Now, again, it was a massive program launched under emergent conditions, and those are usually going to have are usually going to have issues at rollout. So this map shows the percentage of total ERA funds distributed across the country. You can see that only two states distributed more than 75% of their total COVID 19 emergency rental assistance funds, and that is Virginia and Illinois. There's a number of reasons for why these funds didn't make it down or were not eventually used. Um, one of the reasons is undistributed funds. A large portion of the COVID area relief funds were distributed, but there are still funds that have yet to be spent. There are certain time limits on COVID 19 programs. So, programs like school district funding had deadlines for expenditure. Criticisms and concerns. Some aid had been criticized as wasteful or tied up in alleged fraud. When you have someone who believes in these things who's in charge of the disbursement of those dollars, they tend not to be dispersed. Disagreements over how and where to spend those funds have also caused delay in distribution. The unspent or return funds. Uh, More than $425 million promised for rental assistance did not reach tenants or landlords for various reasons. And in some states, they failed to establish programs to spend the money on other things. Uh, Failed to establish those programs or spend the money on other things. The U.S. Department of Labor announced the return of $1.4 billion in unused COVID era funding to the Treasury, with efforts to recover more. So, largely, the ERA rollout suffered by failing to be granular enough. The funds were dispersed from the top down, meaning that almost certainly some individuals at the low end of the ladder would be missed. And as we've seen, lifting a person out of debt poverty so that they can eliminate and not just disperse is how we affirmatively further fair housing. So, what does it look like in the future? Um, the mandate to affirmatively further fair housing has faced a lot of challenge, a lot of change. How it is to be implemented federally will take a new shape. So far as we've seen, it'll take a new shape with each new administration. Uh, so presently, it is not a priority of HUD to affirmatively further fair housing. In 2020, the fair housing assessment was replaced with opportunity zones. That is a number of municipalities identified by the administration that had looser economic zoning laws. That again, the affirmatively furthering fair housing was reinstated in 2021 and then repealed again in 2025. And in 2025, quote, a locality certification that is affirmatively furthered fair housing in accordance with the Fair Housing Act would be deemed sufficient, end quote. And it is from Secretary Scott Turner of HUD. In other words, you just got to say you're doing it and you're doing it. Now, this is a very wordy slide. It is the memo released by HUD that contains that final quote. Uh, I will make these slides available to anyone who wants them after the conclusion of today's presentation, which is right now. So I want to thank you for joining me today to learn about affirmatively furthering fair housing and some of the programs that do that. You can feel free to contact us at any point, even if the housing issue does not turn out to be a fair housing issue. We like to ensure that everybody gets the help that they can. I need to stop recording now, and then I will answer the question that you have dropped into the Q&A box.